And speaking of conspiracies, China has executed a sinister plan. It managed to hack the email of US Commerce Secretary. That's right, the Commerce Minister of the United States of America, a member of Joe Biden's cabinet. She was hacked by America's greatest rival. And this is a serious breach. It goes beyond the Commerce Minister. Accounts of the US State Department were also compromised. Let me first give you a lowdown of what happened and how. Microsoft provides email services to the US government. And the breach happened there. Microsoft systems were compromised. And who was behind the hack? A group called Storm 0558. These are hackers based in China. They gained access to Outlook emails. The breach happened on the 15th of May, and the hackers had access to the emails for a month. That's right. It took a month for the intrusion to be detected and for the access to be blocked. The intrusion was discovered on the 16th of June, just before the US Secretary of State flew off to Beijing. In June, Secretary Blinken made a high-profile visit to China. This was an attempt to resume dialogue with Chinese officials. So when Blinken was heading to China, the Americans knew about this hack, and yet they carried on with the visit. US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was the most high-profile target of this hack. And why do you think the Commerce Department was targeted? Because the US and China have been locked in a trade war. The Commerce Department is at the forefront of America's attempts to contain China. The Biden administration has limited exports to China, especially of sophisticated US technologies like chips and chip-making equipment. The Commerce Department enforces these restrictions. The orders go through the Commerce Secretary. Besides her, a congressional staffer, a US human rights advocate, and some inboxes belonging to the US State Department were also hacked. An investigation is now underway, but American officials say no classified information was compromised. China was asked about the hack, and their response was classic. Listen to this.
I would like to say that in the past, it was usually the world's #1 hacking group, the US National Security Agency, which also serves as the US Cyber Force Command, that released such kind of disinformation. This time, it was the US National Security Council that made a public statement. Whatever agency spoke, it does not change the fact that the US is the world's biggest hacking empire and global cyber chief.
The US is the world's biggest hacking empire and a global cyber thief. That's what they're saying. China has rubbished the charge. They say America's claims are disinformation. But there's enough proof to show that China has intensified its cyber operations. This is not the first breach. In the month of May, an alert was sounded. Multiple agencies issued warnings. In the US, in Australia, in Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, they detected a Chinese hacking operation. A group called Volt Typhoon was behind it, and reports say this was a state-sponsored Chinese campaign. What were these attackers after? Critical infrastructure like communications, electric and gas utilities, and transportation. So the targets are wide-ranging, and the hacks are getting more sophisticated. What does that tell you? China's cyber capabilities are improving. Chinese hackers are focusing on stealth operations where they can linger around emails and servers for months without being detected. It doesn't look good for the US. From spy balloons to cyber hacks, they've seen it all in this year. But the engagements with China continue, at least for now. In fact, they had a high-level meeting today, a meeting of their top diplomats, Antony Blinken and Wang Yi. They're in Jakarta for the ASEAN Foreign Ministers Summit. And what's the purpose of this meeting? Well, the Americans are looking for a détente. And this is a clear shift in approach. In February, remember, when a Chinese spy balloon was caught hovering over US skies, Washington launched missiles to shoot it down. It called off Blinken's planned visit to Beijing. A few weeks later, Blinken attacked China publicly. He accused Beijing of sending military aid to Russia and supporting the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. But now, the US has dialed down the verbal attacks. Instead of combating China and decoupling, they're talking about, quote-unquote, managing differences. From the looks of it, neither plan has worked. What is the cost of your clothes? I'm not talking about the number printed on price tags. My question is about the real cost. Now, if you are not sure, you'll want to watch the story because there's a good chance that your clothes come from fast fashion, which is only getting faster and destroying our planet at a greater speed. I'll tell you more about it, but first some good news. Countries are slowly waking up to the greed of fast fashion, and the latest among them is France. It has released a bonus scheme. It's for those who have a rip in their trousers or a shirt with a misplaced button or a pair of worn-out shoes. France will pay you for these clothes and shoes to be repaired. The government will pay anywhere between $6 and $28. They've set aside $172 million for this. They're calling it the Repair Bonus Fund. It will be used over the span of 5 years, and it's meant to encourage people to mend their clothes. I know it sounds quite random, but it's also intelligent. You see, France has a clothing waste problem. It generates 700,000 tons of textile waste every year. About 2/3 of this ends up in landfills. But this problem is not unique to France. The world over, 92 million tons of textile is discarded every year. 92 million tons every year. A truck full of waste clothes is dumped in a landfill every second. What explains this? Fast fashion. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. It began during the 1990s. That's when retailers began to introduce cheaper clothes. So cheap that people scrambled to buy them. But what made these clothes affordable? Their quality or the lack of it. These clothes were poorly made. They were mass-produced at breakneck speed to match the pace of fashion trends. Decades later, fast fashion is still in trend. It has made style cheap and convenient, and we all lap it up. Think about your wardrobe. And be honest. Remember that outfit you were once so eager to buy, the one that's now buried at the back of your closet. How long has it been since you last wore it? We buy a different outfit for every occasion, or a new outfit to match a new trend. Yet so many clothes languish deep inside our cupboards. Many of them don't fit us anymore. Others have gone out of fashion. Some have never ever been worn. Here's what a study found. A majority of people wear just 20% of their closet 80% of the time. And at least 12% of our clothes are quote-unquote inactive, meaning they've been forgotten about. Out of sight, out of mind. And yet we continue to buy more clothes. The average consumer is now buying 60% more clothing than they did 15 years ago. Because fast fashion offers us the choice to do so. It churns out new styles on an ever shorter cycle. But it does not design or produce clothes that last. So it's ironic that they last almost forever. More than 60% of fibers used in clothes are synthetic. So when our clothing ends up in a landfill, it does not decay. And this cycle is problematic from the word go. It starts with how the fast fashion industry produces clothes. The boom in production has increased carbon emissions. Textile production generates 10% of global carbon emissions. It contributes to 20% of global wastewater. After all, it takes 20,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of cotton and 2,700 liters of water to make just one T-shirt. That's enough water for one person to drink for 900 days. Is a new dress or a trendy pair of jeans really worth it? Maybe it's time to check our privilege, because fast fashion is ultimately about that. The privilege to buy as many clothes as we want, usually only for their style. And it is a privilege to ignore the environmental consequences of all of it, not just in the now, but also in the future. By 2030, 134 million tons of textile waste will be discarded annually. And the apparel industry's global emissions will double. So it's time for us to slow down, to appreciate what we have before we try to acquire more. And I must say, a lot of what I've said is a note to self. Shopping feels good in the moment, but the repercussions may not be worth it. So let's try to buy sustainably, recycle our belongings, reuse them, because when it comes to fashion waste, a stitch in time could save our planet. Have you heard about the AK-47? I'm sure you know this is an assault rifle. It is one of the most popular ones out there. The AK-47 was originally developed by the Soviet Union, but it reached the Afghan Mujahideen during the 1980s. And since then, it has become a symbol of terrorists and terror groups. But now these groups are looking to trade up. They want NATO-grade weapons. And guess who is selling it to them? The Taliban. The rulers of Kabul have now become arms dealers. But how did this happen? You see, the Taliban came to power in the year 2021. It was a sudden power grab. The US military was forced to retreat. It was a hasty withdrawal. They left behind weapons, and a lot of them at that. Now, these weapons are flowing from Afghanistan into the global market. Basically, the Taliban is selling them. And who are the buyers? Anyone who is willing to pay the price. Insurgent groups, terrorists, militias, from the Al-Shabaab in Africa to the TTP in neighboring Pakistan, everyone who can afford to buy these weapons is buying them. And how many weapons are we talking about? The US left behind equipment worth $7.12 billion in Afghanistan. Imagine that. More than $7 billion of defense equipment. And that's not even the full picture. Since the year 2003, the US has given Afghan forces more than 600,000 weapons. 600,000 weapons, 300 aircraft, more than 80,000 vehicles, night vision goggles, biometric systems, basically everything that the US Army used. They gave it to the Afghan forces. And where did all of it go? Well, the Pentagon has no clue, but the world knows. They fell into the Taliban's hands. So basically, it was a failed system. America flooded Afghanistan with billions of dollars of weapons. But they did not care where these weapons went. There is no record of most of this. They don't know what was lost, what was given to the Afghan forces, what the Afghan forces sold to the Taliban, and what was later recovered. So amid all of this confusion, these weapons have showed up again. This time in black markets, from ad hoc bazaars in the desert to makeshift shops on the side of highways. The Taliban is selling these weapons everywhere, and they're making sure they get a premium price. I'll give you an example. A knockoff AK-47 sells for around $130 in these black markets. But an American M4 assault rifle can go for as much as $2,400. Imagine that. An assault rifle being sold for $2,400, and that too in the black market. The market price is anywhere between $800 and $2,000. The night vision goggles are also a popular purchase. They sell for nearly $1,000, which brings us to the next big question. Where are all of these weapons going? The answer is everywhere. Neighboring Pakistan, Africa, Gaza, Balochistan, and even Kashmir. These weapons are flooding conflict zones. Recently, there were dramatic images of the Tehreek-e-Taliban or TTP attacking the Pakistan police. They had American assault rifles. They were wearing night vision goggles. And this ability to operate at night can be a game changer. Even in Kashmir, these weapons are being used by terror groups, the likes of Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Toiba. The valley is flooded with US M4 and M16 assault rifles. Authorities say they're seeing these weapons for the first time. So clearly, this is a worrying development. Now, for the Taliban, this is just like any other business. They've run smuggling networks for decades, selling drugs, gems, and other contraband. So arms trade is just another source of income for them. It doesn't matter who buys it. But for conflict zones, this is a very dangerous development. These weapons give terrorists an edge. And this is a serious setback in the fight against terrorism, all because of American callousness. The US trained the Afghan army for 2 decades. They spent some $83 billion to equip them. The same army could not stop the Taliban. For that matter, even the US army could not stop the Taliban. They left Afghanistan in a mess. And now the rest of the world has to suffer the consequences. So Paris is all decked up. But around 500 kilometers away, in Strasbourg, the sentiment is different. It's not warm or welcoming, it's cold and insulting. This city is home to the European Parliament. It's in session right now. And on Wednesday, they discussed Manipur. Now don't worry, we're as confused as you are. The violence in Manipur has nothing to do with Europe or any of these countries, in fact. India says it's an internal matter, but European lawmakers do not care. They decided that Manipur requires their urgent attention. Around 6 parliamentary groups called for a debate and resolution. Yesterday, their wish was granted. The whole thing lasted around 20 minutes. That's it. 20 minutes to unpack a decades-old conflict. But then again, these MPs were not concerned about nuance. Their focus was to defame and insult India. We listened to the whole thing, and we identified 3 themes. 3 themes of what was discussed at the European Parliament. The first is to use Manipur as the symptom of a bigger problem. And what's that? The same old backsliding democracy argument. Listen to this.
We should all be worried about the worsening human rights situation in India. Freedom of press has narrowed, journalists and activists have been arrested for false reasons, discrimination and hate have increased. And this is also what I saw personally when I visited India in December.
Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident across India. Those who are not Hindu, in particular Christians, are facing growing intolerance, violence, humiliation, discrimination. We're seeing this in anti-conversion laws in different federal states.
So it's not just Manipur, it's the whole of India, according to them. The second theme is to present this as some sort of a religious war, sort of like an anti-crusade. Each speaker talked about Christians being under attack in India, about churches being vandalized. For many of them, that is the red line. Take a look at this.
India is an important partner to the European Union, but if we as a Christian community can respect other faiths and identities, we must ask our partners to do the same.
Persecutions of Christians are real, and it is our duty to make sure that they stop, also in Manipur.
Tells you how shallow their understanding of the subject is. The violence in Manipur involves two communities, the Meiteis and the Kukis. The Meiteis are predominantly Hindus, the Kukis are mostly Christians. But religion is not the biggest fault line here. Their conflict goes back decades to other issues, like land ownership, like reservation in jobs and colleges. Clearly, the European MPs are not aware of this, and how would they be? Even Indian citizens, a lot of them, have a hard time understanding this. So what chance do white men sitting 7,000 kilometers away have? But that is not stopping them. These MPs are cut from a different cloth, it seems. Their confidence does not come from knowledge, it comes from entitlement. So this is what they said. Anyway, on to the third theme, to discredit India's Prime Minister and government. And there's a clear pattern here. Before the US visit, we heard a lot of chatter about human rights. A State Department report questioned India's religious freedoms. It recommended blacklisting India. And now Europe is doing the very same thing. The Prime Minister landed on the 13th of July. The Manipur debate happened on the 12th. This is too close to be a coincidence. Some of the MPs went directly after India's top leadership, sort of like a name and shame.
Since he entered power in 2014, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, has been implementing a radical nationalist Hindu policy, which has had terrible consequences. Journalists, religious minorities, and human rights fighters. He always says that he is an heir to Mahatma Gandhi. We all admire. He takes meditation time. He created a World Yoga Day. He seems kind and well-meaning. But in India, millions of Muslims and Christians suffer every single day because the government violates their most fundamental rights.
There's criticism, and then there is whatever that was. And this is happening way too often to call it a coincidence. You lay out the red carpet on one side, you host a state dinner with all the pomp and show, but at the same time, your parliament hurls insults. You accuse your guests of persecuting people at home. How is this acceptable? India has firmly rejected the so-called debate. The Foreign Secretary reiterated that Manipur is an internal matter for India.
On the Manipur question, Suhasini, this is a matter totally internal to India. We are aware of what the Brussels in the Parliament happening, and we have made a reach out to the concerned EU parliamentarians, but we have made it very clear to them this is a matter totally and absolutely internal to India.
It's a simple concept. But the West is like those nosy neighbors. They simply cannot mind their own business. Now, can you imagine if the situation was reversed? If the Indian Parliament discussed the riots in France or the collapse of the Dutch government, it would be beyond absurd. But if you think about it, there is a lot to discuss. Europe has major human rights issues. For example, Islamophobia is on the rise. Just last month, the Quran was publicly burnt in Sweden, a copy of the Quran. Their Prime Minister called it freedom of expression. Another issue is the anti-immigration rhetoric. France itself was torn apart by the crisis earlier this month. So the fact is, Europe has a full plate. Their so-called union is pulling apart. But what do they want to discuss? Manipur in India. These European MPs want tough action against India. They say keep human rights in mind while discussing trade deals. Unfortunately for them, the European Union may not listen. Western governments have largely been positive towards India. It's only these entitled pockets that speak against it. But how do they get these platforms to preach? And it's easy to dismiss all of this as freedom of speech, but look at the larger template. It's always against India, it's always before a major visit, and it's always the same issues. It's less about speech and more about conspiring. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with North Korea, the country's media has released the footage of its latest ballistic missile launch. Meanwhile, a brawl broke out in Kosovo's parliament. Lawmakers threw fists at each other after Kosovo's prime minister was sprayed with water during his address. While some politicians were fighting in Kosovo, others were offering each other coffee in Lithuania. Dutch Prime Minister Rutte asked the Ukrainian President Zelensky where he got his cup of coffee from. Zelensky offered his coffee to the Dutch leader, but he refused, saying, "You're fighting a war, this is your coffee." The two then decided to share the beverage. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1930, the first ever FIFA World Cup began in the South American nation of Uruguay. FIFA selected this country because its national football team won the Olympic football tournament against Argentina in 1928. It was the last football tournament organized as a part of the Summer Olympics. We're leaving you with that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Nuk ka votim.
Qetësi, ju lutem.
Është bërë e ne nuk e kemi kundërshtuar edhe denoncuar.
Nalu bre, nalu. Ju lutem, policia brenda kuvendit.
You get that coffee.
You want tea? Tea time.
No, you are fighting a war. This is your coffee. No, you have to stay home.
Okay, I will share you. 50%.
Would you get it?
Then, yes, I will share it.